Chapter 18 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At Littlecott Inn. Littlecott, I found, lay up a side lane, close by the great main road to Winchester. It missed the din and dust of the highway only by a few hundred yards, but in itself was quiet enough. Sitting at lunch in the common room of the inn by the open window, I could hear the low roar of the motor traffic afar off, a deep sound much like that of a busy London street, but lacking its continuity. Here it was a pulse, beating strong yet slow. It came and went with a strange regularity. There was always the rushing, mighty voice of the wind in the trees, but this voice deepened to bass, then back again to its hissing tenor as each motor swept by. For the first time on my ramble, I found myself listening to the noise of mechanical traffic almost with pleasure, so rhythmic and restful was the sound. Out again in the frolicking sun and shadow of the street, I looked about me for the post office. I soon found it. It was a queer old house with latticed casements above and bull's-eye panes in the lower windows. Here the only sign of postal business was a letter-box, the windows being filled with the usual heterogeneous wares of a village shop. Rather undecided as to what lay before me, I first strolled by on the opposite side of the way. Then, crossing the street, I came back to the little shop and fell to studying the contents of the window. The shop seemed outrageously dark within. I could see nothing but what lay immediately under my eyes: bacon, candles, corduroy trousers, sheep dip, linen drapery, all the usual happy family of village needs. But just as I was meditating another quiet turn down the road, still undecided as to procedure, the sun came sparkling out behind me, and one rich yellow beam struck into the gloom of the shop. I all but started back. Right in its dazzling path stood a figure, that of a tall, bright, happy-looking girl. She had but just risen from a little desk at the counter, where she had been writing. She stood quite still in the sun, her brown eyes meeting its rays unflinchingly. Every little detail of her face was revealed to me with microscopic clearness. Her ruddy cheeks and lips, her firm brows, her dark abundance of hair flowing back from the high forehead. And she was laughing about something. The conviction fell upon me that it was at sight of my own face pressed upon the glass. No doubt she had been watching me all the time. There was only one thing to be done. Putting on my most benevolent, most fatherly air, I opened the door of the shop and went in. I bought stamps, picture postcards, notepaper, a pencil I did not want. Finally asked permission to write a letter at the little desk. And all the time I was falling head over ears in love with Clara. She seemed so merry and winning and frank. She had such a fund of talk, such an artesian well of laughter at the smallest pleasantry, was so genuinely happy to help a stranger in his need for local information, that presently I was vowing in my heart that no swashbuckling soldier should ever have her, but that she should mate with my young archangel of the forest, if I had to stand guard at the door until he came and took her off to church. But what could I really do to further the matter? Very little, it seemed to me, as I sat ostensibly busy on my writing, but actually studying Clara out of the tail of my eye as she went about her work in the shop. I had a forlorn hope at first that I might lead her on to making a confidante of me, as the young groom had done. In that event, my task would have been easy. But obviously this was the last thing in the world likely to happen. She was certainly not in love with anyone, nor had she a care in life to judge from her bright, contented face. What if I told her all about the conversation in the wood, and urged her to make her young suitor happy in the only way that happiness could ever come to him? I knew that, being a woman, this would infallibly decide her in the opposite way. I spun my letter out to an unconscionable length. I finished one sheet and began on another. I gnawed the end of the penholder to shreds. At last I sorrowfully gave up the whole business. Kismet, said I half aloud, wholly in desperation. And all the time the very thing that I wanted lay in the palm of my hand. Clara had gone to the shop door and looked up the street. Looking for whom? I asked myself, yet needing no answer. Now she came towards me, bringing a piece of blotting paper. I lifted my hand with the thing in it. It was a paperweight, with which I had been toying all the time. One of a not uncommon pattern, a ball of glass embedded in a plinth of some dark shining wood. "What do you use this for?" I asked her. She gave me a laugh and a look. "What should I use it for?" said she. "It keeps the papers from flying away when the door is opened, and—" "Ah, but it can be used for a very different purpose. Don't you know that some people can tell fortunes by looking into a glass ball like that?" Again the little dark shop rang with that merry laugh, and, if I had ever been in doubt of the wisdom of my purpose, I was in no sort of doubt then. In the midst of her merriment, she became suddenly grave. "Can you do it?" "Well, I have often tried. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes failed. Would you like me to see if I can tell your fortune?" She looked back into an inner room, apparently to assure herself that nobody was within earshot. "It is rather stupid, isn't it? I shouldn't believe a word. Of course it is all nonsense. Do try, will you? Just close your hands over the ball for a minute, so. Now give it to me, and you must keep quite quiet while I look into it." Years ago I had seen a professional crystal gazer at work, so I was well up in the business. I looked solemnly down into the ball. "There is nothing yet," said I after a long pause. "It is all cloudy. Ah, now the clouds are beginning to move. They seem to be clearing. Yes, I can see something now. I can see some figures. Men, I think, but it is too misty yet. Yes, there are two men. One is much higher up than the other. Oh, I can make it out now. One is on horseback, and the other walking by his side. There, the clouds have come back. I can see nothing." There was no laugh now. The girl leaned her hand upon the desk. The desk trembled. "Do look again. Do, please." I bent to the pious deception once more, renouncing my own philosophy as to means and ends. It is still cloudy. No, there is nothing at all. Wait, though. The clouds are moving again. There is only one figure now. No, there are two, but the horseman has fallen far behind. He is only a speck in the distance. The man in front is walking fast. I can make him out quite plainly. He carries a little cane and has a funny-looking cap on his head. He seems to be dressed in dark clothes. Ah, now I see. It is a dark green uniform. He is a soldier, a burly young man with... Oh, how provoking! The clouds have rolled over the picture again and hidden everything. I stole a look at Clara's face here. The colour on her cheeks had all centred into two bright patches, and she was biting her lip, as I could have sworn, with vexation. Go on, do look again. That cannot be all. You can never tell, you know. Sometimes it leaves off just like that, and nothing comes again. But I will try. I let some moments pass while I stared into the depths of the crystal. The little shop was quiet as death, but for the girl's quick breathing. When I judged her sufficiently primed, I got to work again. Now the mist is moving fast. There is a figure. Yes, it is the soldier again, and still alone. I cannot see the horseman. Wait. It is so misty behind. He may be only hidden. Ah, now he has come into full view. He is much nearer. He is catching up the soldier again. Now he is abreast of him, has passed him, is pressing on in front. Ah, the soldier has lost the race, and no wonder. He is hopelessly in the rear. Why, he has stopped, turned, and gone back. And the horseman is coming on faster than ever. Now I can see his face. What a handsome young fellow! There is something hanging from his saddle peak, something bright and red. But the mist is gathering so, I can scarcely make out... Oh yes, now I see. It is a bunch of red flowers. Roses, I think. But it is all getting so vague. Ah, the clouds have come up. I can see no more. It is finished. I put the crystal aside and turned again to my letter. For a full 2 minutes Clara stood at my elbow like a woman changed into stone. Then she backed slowly away. You are a wizard, said she after a while, with a little high-strung, nervous laugh. I'm frightened out of my wits, but of course it is all nonsense. Oh, very likely, I returned as casually as possible, looking up from my writing. And I should advise you not to give it a single serious thought. The present is far too important in life for us to bother about the future. I hastened to add a postscript to the letter. Remember, not a word to her about our meeting at Tytherley, nor of your having ever seen or heard of me in your life. All's fair in love or war. You are to come to Littlecott at your usual time on Sunday afternoon. And, whatever you do, do not forget the roses. She may or may not tell you of the visit of the elderly gentleman who discovered such surprising things in the paperweight. I think she will keep this a secret for ever, or at least for the next week or two. But if she does tell you, be sure to look sufficiently astonished. And now I must get a lift into Winchester as quickly as possible to post this letter. Good-bye, my dear boy. Go in and win, and good luck to you. and God's blessing on you both. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sunday morning in Winchester. Sunday morning in Winchester, and, so far, the coldest, the brightest, the breeziest morning of all. In the cathedral close the leaves were flying. Grey pigeons fluttered here and there on the vast front of the cathedral, or lanced down through the sunlight. The transverse paths in the close were thronged with people all hurrying towards the west door. And over all, far up in the blue sky, it seemed, a solemn, deep-throated bell tolled for service, its hoarse voice strangely varying, as though the wind drove the sound about, just as it was driving the red lime leaves. This was no ordinary Sunday that I had chanced upon in Winchester. The autumn assizes were being held, and today the judges would attend the cathedral service in state, escorted thither by the mayor and corporation in full regalia. I had been warned that if I would secure one of the coveted seats in the chancel, between the choir stalls and the sanctuary, I must get there betimes. But even thus early, all the town seemed to be flocking towards the cathedral. I made what haste was decently possible, and found myself at length on one of the foremost benches, whence I had an uninterrupted view down the vast nave. With most cathedrals, the immediate effect of being in them is to make you think of other cathedrals. An endless array of comparisons springs up in the mind, and the pleasure that you might have in what is before you is often discounted by the memory of something finer farther away. But Winchester has this unique quality, that once you have passed its door, it is the only cathedral in the world for you. Other great and beautiful churches are greater and more beautiful, it may well be, but the loveliest and grandest of them is only built of stone, while Winchester is built of air and sunlight. And not only that, the very life of the air is in its soaring, snow-white intricacy of column and arch, so that every cloud that dims the sun changes it bodily, and the travelling light forms and dissolves and forms again its aerial masonry, giving you the impression of a great white rose expanding its multitudinous petals under your very eyes. So it seemed to me as I sat in the crowded chancel, waiting for the arrival of the judges and their municipal escort. Through the towering choir screen, black with the venerable blackness of age which is never sombre, the whole vast nave was visible. The sunshine, coming aslant through the windows of the eastern aisle, struck only upon those wonderful fluted pillars, leaving the bays between quiet in twilight, and giving to the nave an appearance of immeasurable length and height. I tried to estimate the girth of the great columns, the span of the arches, the real altitude of the forest roof of white tracery overhead, the distance between the reredos, carved out of the same summer cloud-like stone, and the west door, open and framing in a vivid rectangle of autumn crimson and gold, but the thing was impossible. Human ideas of mensuration seem to fail here as they fail in the night star-house of the ether. It was not that you were brought face to face with utter boundlessness. It was that there was nothing here to measure, nothing that began or ended, nothing that kept solidity or dimension for more than a moment. In the sunlight, incessantly flowing or waning to and fro, in the shadows, for ever changing place and form and intensity, in the very air of the place that seemed to have a mirage power of hiding the real stone while giving shape and substance to the mere dust motes, there was the same irresistible feeling of growth, of a beautiful expanding and soaring efflorescence, as though we, wandering children in the wilderness, had stopped here to make holy ground for worship, and forthwith the cloudy pillar had enveloped us, leaguing with the sunshine to build us a tabernacle out of mist and light. A strange silence, the whispering, rustling silence that always holds where a great congregation is brought together, dwelt in the entire cathedral. The bell still tolled, making a solemn, sweet, booming sound, very quiet and far away. The minutes crept on. At length this bell stopped, and high up in the cathedral tower the clock began to strike, droned through its 11 muffled mighty notes, then seemed to leave the whole building vibrating in a deeper silence than ever. For all the whispering and rustling had abruptly ceased. All eyes were now turned towards the far-off western door, where, out in the wind and leaf-winnowed sunlight, another crowd was gathered. I could hear the low tumult of their voices, strangely contrasting with the hush, close-wrought, expectant, that was over the great concourse within. I looked at the sea of rapt, intent faces around me. I knew that my own face showed the same eagerness, the same downright excitement, and I asked myself, were we agog with all this strained expectancy really because of the thing that had ostensibly brought us here? The two seemed out of all proportion. There we were, standing on tiptoe, neck craning beyond neck, every eye fixed on that patch of far-off flickering sunshine, just for what, to all but me, must long have grown a familiar spectacle, coming twice in each year of our lives. What it really was that moved so strangely the other units in the crowd was known, probably, not even to themselves. Instinct brought them there. They stayed. They went home again, the impulse gratified. But for myself, an old and often inconvenient habit of analysing emotions seemed to give a clue to the situation. I had come to the cathedral for the place itself, with but a casual, almost languid interest in what I was to see. Yet 20 minutes waiting in that vast, quiet, cavernous place had wholly transformed me. Why, I asked myself again, and the answer seemed to be that, though I cared little for church-going judges and corporations, I cared a great deal for what they alone could now bring me. That long wait in the cathedral, wherein I had drunk my fill of the beauty of form, rightly the one appeal of architecture, had left me hungering and thirsting for the other two that go to make the trinity of perfect beauty, generous colour and sound. In the whole wide space there was the blackness of the carven oak, and the wreathing, pale loveliness of the stonework, but of colour almost nothing, and of music only the one dim, reiterated tone. No wonder those who pass so much of their lives in the wan, hueless precincts of these great churches delight to make of their ritual a feast of music and colour. It becomes the necessity that knows no law. If, at that moment, the very Pope of Rome had filled Protestant Winchester with all the glittering mitres and monstrances, all the flaring perambulation of gold and purple in his great see, I, for one, should have been only delighted and edified. I stood staring down the misty sunlit glade of the cathedral, ripe and ready for the bravest that legal or civic pomp could show. The silence just then seemed too profound to be broken by anything short of a thunderclap. But, as the cutting of a silken cord launches a great battleship, the merest thread of music now brought our whole great house of quiet tumbling about our ears. Outside in the rippling sunshine of the cathedral close, there rang out one long, dim fanfaronade of trumpets, and at once the waiting choir burst forth. 100 voices, it seemed, led by the great organ, sent the strains of the national anthem flooding to the roof. The procession began to pour up the nave, the white surplice singing choir, the priests, the judges, the garrison commandants, the mayor with aldermen and councillors in train. Scarlet of divinity and scarlet of law, scarlets of municipal and military power, gold glint of uniforms, college hoods in crimson and white and blue, the rich deep purple of the councillors' robes, and the bedizened beadle carrying his shining mace on high. The whole stream of luxuriant colour came flowing up the wide nave, up the chancel steps, and drew to rest in the place of honour reserved for it amidst the old black filigree of the stalls. Every gleam of prismatic light and every note of that grand symphony came to me like rain after drought. Eyes and ears drank deep, drank again and again, while the judges in their wigs and ermine capes settled down to their places, and the mayor rustled into his throne behind the mace, and the officiating priests got out their holy books for the service to come. The music died away, the silence gathered again, and in the midst of it came one low clear note from the organ, followed by words that all but startled an exclamation from my lips. I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Here was an absolutely astounding thing. The very words I had heard a week before in the little church on Ilchester marshes, raised in exhortation to a crowd of poverty-stricken peasants, were chosen now to admonish this exalted company. High-placed clerics and eminent judges, gallant master soldiers, the chief dignitaries of a great provincial town, here they were all together, ready to kneel in prayer on the fine carpets of a cathedral, at call of the same simple words that had brought the yokels to their knees on the drugget of the little village church. I was startled, I say, at this obvious, inevitable thing. I know, and knew then, that I had no more reason to be startled than at the sight of blue in a summer sky. But for all that, it came to me with intensely novel, awakening force. For we live all our lives under the shelter of great truths, and just because they are common, universal, eternal, we seldom think of looking up to see what blesses us. Sunshine, the air, the bread-giving earth, the Catholic faith. Shall we, in their full enjoyment, ever be great enough to estimate them at the price of their loss? I had listened to the Old English morning prayer in many churches, great and small, but never with so much delight and profit as there, in the crowded chancel of Winchester. It was leisurely and staid and reverent. Quietude, hastelessness were the dominant key notes through all, and the music seemed to me the last thing in refined beauty. It was good to see the worldly old judges, the apple-faced mayor, and the gorgeous beadle singing out lustily together. Good to see all kneeling, scarlet and homespun, high and low, in the same common brotherhood of prayer. And when sermon time came, and the judge's chaplain mounted the pulpit, instead of one of Winchester's usual mentors, it was good to see dean and canons and prebendaries settling down to listen with the humblest layman there. He was a personable man, the judge's chaplain, a fine, stalwart, thick-set man, with a woolsy face and carriage, admirably set off by his flowing black silk robes, his cambric weepers, his Durham hood of brilliant blue. He began with the usual long and quaint exhortation to prayer for all manner of things under the sun, delivered with much sonorousness and formality. This done, he faced squarely about, studied the elements in his congregation for a quiet moment or two, then began his discourse in a very different strain. It was not long before I guessed that he had lately received much the same sharp reminder of the gliding propensities of time as had come to me in Amesbury when listening to the song of the river. I judged him to have been thinking a good deal on the matter of late, as I myself had been doing. Only in his case, apparently, no wise old man had come to his elbow with counsel such as had put my own dubities at rest. The problem of how to grow old cropped up continually in the trend of the sermon, but each time he touched upon it, I could not see that he brought a solution much nearer. Rather, he called down about it obscuring thoughts of melancholy and foreboding, which a courageous resignation seemed to harden rather than temper. And the deeper he got into his subject, the more profoundly it seemed to lead him into troubled and tentative paths. He had loved life well, I should say, and small blame to him, and it was a sore thing, though he would not own to it, to see it slipping away. His words seemed to carry a vision of life as a voyage on a river, whose course had lain many leagues through spangled meadow and prosperous sunshine. But now there was visible ahead a wall of ominous grey mist, into which the river flowed and vanished, to come out again, no doubt, into a greater brilliance and prosperity than ever. But through what dark interval, and when? He began with rather an over-refinement of manner, the pregnant words clogged, as I thought, by too perfect breeding in a sincere, earnest man. I guessed, as he warmed to his work, that he would sooner or later break away from these cobweb manacles, the aegis of his office, and that the true, naked-souled man would win boldly out. And so it happened. Always with complete reserve and restraint, never letting his voice lift above its steady level, the strong nature of the man began to vibrate and heave under the suave exterior and professional gravity and importance. And in the end he made a great triumph out of his very difficulties. There was no doubt of the meaning he flashed to us then. Old age must come, death must come, We must all pass into the valley of the shadow. These were great mysteries. If you can admit their truth and still face them all without a tremor of foreboding, well, then you are more than human, more than I. See how the shadows gather round the way and will not be denied. And yet be of good heart. There is still something, the one great saving clause, to be reckoned with. It was all told, not in these words, nor in any words, but by a look, an eloquent pause, a bowed head. And then the spoken line, clear and low in the silence. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The amenities of coal-heaving. There was quite a string of traffic going my way out of Winchester on Monday morning. Standing under the great statue of King Alfred that guards the southern approach to the town, I let the first 2 or 3 vehicles go by as unsuited for my leisurely purpose, finally deciding on a coal cart, partly because of its deliberate pace, and partly because the driver looked more than ordinarily interesting. 20 years' experience of amateur vagrancy up and down England has failed altogether to account for one fact about country coal heavers. They are invariably gentlemen. It would seem that there is something about coal dealing that refines and humanises a man. I have only a small acquaintance with those who dig it out of mines, and none with those who vend it in the great populated centres. But in country districts I have never fallen in with a coal peddler without being morally the better for it. And not only are they men of sound social parts, very often you will find them possessed of knowledge that can be come by only through close observation and diligent reflection. One will tell you the name of every bird in the hedgerow as you journey on by his side. Another may be deeply versed in weather lore. A coal heaver who once gave me a lift on a starry night in Devonshire told me the names of all the constellations, and, in his spare time, amused himself by drawing horoscopes. The Winchester coalman made me a seat on his near shaft out of some empty coal sacks, which he beat against the wheel until they were fairly clean. He himself rode on the other shaft, his long legs dangling almost to the ground, and before we had gone half a mile I was so impressed by his intelligence that I ventured to broach this very matter to him. His first words put an instant new light on the subject. "Coals," said he, "is heavy stuff and dirty stuff, and thirsty ain't the word for it. Then you sells them to women mostly. Then you takes them a long way, miles into the country, and you must sit and think, or look about ye, for hours together. Then there's good profit to it. A man may keep a better home about him by coal sellin' than by most other things, if he can stand the life. But that's just where 'tis. 'Tain't the coal as makes the man, 'tis the coal that breaks him. Leastways all but one kind o' him. Many try it, but only one sort o' man thrives at the work. If you've nought but a strong back, ye're no good at coal sellin'. You must ha' head and heart as well as body. There's the dust and the loneliness. Once let them drive you to the public house, and you're done. There's the women again. you must be spry and politeful. Look clean under your dirt. Allers ha' the right word to each other, and the right coal at the right time, or trade will go to nawthin'. And there's the hardship and long hours, out in all weathers, and meals no time or any time. Now, where will you find your coalman? One here and there in a score, maybe. I allers says as coal sellers is bishops and prize fighters spiled. There's another thing,' he went on, thoughtfully flicking his whip at the binds of travellers' joy that reached out to us from the hedgerows. A coalman, he's allers passin' the time o' day with folks. Come night time, 'tain't company as he wants, but quiet and fireside, a home, not an inn. Them as works alone in the fields gets together o' nights over pipe and glass. Nature drives 'em to it. But the coal seller thinks o' nought then but his own chimney nook. So he looks about him early to marry. Now, when ye were wonderin' why coalmen are what they are, did ye never think of lookin' at their wives? I confessed I never had. Ah, ye'd ha' learned more'n I could tell ye, he said impressively. Women is wonderful discernin', they looks before they leaps. 'Tain't the flash young labourin' man with 15 shillin's a week as gets the best o' 'em, 'tis the home lovin' man as is earnin' good money. There's your coalman all over. You see, 'tis a woman question in the main, arter all. That was my first lift for the day, and I decided it should be the last one. Though the morning was as fine as ever, the north east wind remained so piercingly cold that brisk walking was a constant necessity. At the nearest village I left my coal pedlar lustily shouting his wares down the street, and pushed on alone. I was now in the very heart of Hampshire, and well satisfied with my lot. It was rolling, open farm country, with rich tracts of fine timber, the foliage of the trees still wonderfully green. The advance of autumn seemed here not merely arrested, but turned back in its course. Though I had been steadily forging eastward since I had left the Devon coast 12 days before, there was no appreciable decline in the luxuriance of growth around me. And here in Hampshire there was something I had missed in the other counties traversed, the ruddy warmth of red brick wall and roof. There are, of course, brick and tile buildings everywhere in the land, but among southern counties I have seen them nowhere in such profusion as in this stretch of country lying between Winchester and the Sussex border. Easton, the first village I struck that day, was principally of red brick, and Avington, a few miles farther on, lay smouldering in the same beautiful colour. I have often thought that in one respect the tiled roof has a great advantage over the thatched roof, inasmuch as it allows freer scope for one of nature's principal means of beauty giving. From the modern housemaker's point of view, the warping and sagging of timber is an unmitigated evil. All his carefully wrought straight lines and true rectangles are destroyed, his perpendiculars vitiated. He cannot understand that a house which is newly built is as yet only like the babe just born. After the building must come the growing. Sun and wind and rain must be allowed to work their will upon it. And what a blessed thing the warping of timber really is, can only be estimated by a study of these old tiled cottage roofs. One in particular that I chanced upon during that morning's ramble would have whitened the hair of any modern builder. The old artificers brought their wood to the old adze green or dry, just as the mood beset them. And from this house 100 years of shower and sunshine had banished the last trace of the rectilinear, if this slur had ever indeed rested upon it. The entire building had been moulded by time into a maze of gentle curves and subsidences. In the outset, not a timber of its massive frame could have been square or straight, nor was there a cube in the brick filling that tallied with its fellows. All these had gone the road of picturesque evolution in the same loving comradeship together. But it was in the roof that this natural growth out of the original, crude, rough and ready handiwork was chiefly evident. If it had been thatched, there would have been, at most, 20 years of this influence visible. A good thatch will stand the score of winters, but then it must be renewed and brought back to callow babyhood. But a roof of British oak, solidly laid together and tiled with the old porous tiles, will come through centuries of storm and flood, gathering upon it with each year only more grace and beauty. Looking at this old house, it was difficult to escape the conclusion that either the house had shrunk or the roof got larger, for the tiles drooped down over odd corners, or overhung the windows in an otherwise inexplicable way. From gable to gable the roof made a wavering hollow line, intensely red against the blue sky. Some of the vertical beams had curved outward, and some inward. The horizontal rafters, on which the tiles were hung, festooned from beam to beam, like a dew-laden spider web, and thus the tiles spread downward on the steep roof side in an ever varying succession of ripples that seemed instinct with a gentle ebb and flow of life. It is not easy to convey a real idea of the beauty of mere shape and pattern that the warping of the timbers had brought to the old roof, but to tell of its colour would be frankly beyond the reach of any words, or perhaps of any palate. November sees the awakening of the mosses and lichens into active growth and life after the long summer drought. The sagging, winding action of the old beams and rafters had opened thousands of tiny chinks and crevices between the tiles, and from each of them some minutely beautiful plant stretched forth tentacles of gold and green. Modern architects are using the red roof tile everywhere in their building, and so far their action is commendable. But it is not enough to copy the ancients in this without harking back still farther. The art of tile making seems completely lost nowadays. The modern roof tile is a hard, glassy thing that only blackens under sunlight and the stress of weather. It holds no moisture, and nothing can ever root in it. This old roof, glowing in the autumn sunshine with a myriad soft hues of amber and umber and pearly grey, owes its loveliness to the fact that the tiles, hard and true burnt as they are, still retain their original porous quality. The lichen tendrils burrow into them, and year by year make a braver show of beauty. Even slate can support some hardy forms of lichen life, but the 20th century roof tile is hopeless from the beginning. Nature can prevail against it no more than she can against corrugated iron. Towards the noon of that day I came down into what seemed to me the most silent, deserted place in the world. It was a tiny village lying at the bottom of a valley, whelmed in shade and the sound of many waters. But this incessant trickling, near and far, only served to intensify the silence that dwelt over it. Here and there a streak of blue smoke chevied away on the breeze. I saw a dog asleep in a barrel, and one child on a doorstep, a solemn, elderly child, regaling on bread and butter, who looked at me in mute appraisement, as Crusoe might have looked at a passing goat. But no other human being was visible. And as I wandered down the grass-grown street, held by the slumberous quiet of the place, its gloom, the siren song of its waters, there came over me the conviction that this child was indeed the sole representative of his race. The eerie notion fixed itself in my mind. Perhaps he had never looked upon his kind before. Perhaps he had sat on that doorstep since the day some neglectful stork had dropped him there to munch and wait until he should be remembered and fetched away to somebody's cradle. Perhaps, indeed, he expected I had come to do it. I turned at that thought and looked back with a sudden apprehension. The child had got to his feet. He was toddling towards me, holding out his bread and butter as though he offered it for passage money into the unknown. The wind swept overhead with a derisive shrillness. All about me the waters murmured their slow incantation. The air of the place seemed to thicken with an imminent purpose against me, and still the child came on. These queer moments of obsession are very near to folly, yet they are seldom the experience of fools. You cannot wave a belief in an abiding spirit to places if you go much in ancient human haunts and alone. And here I felt the solitary little settlement, deep in its grey cleft of valley, to have got some mysterious and unholy lien upon me. I took one more glance at the child, stealthily creeping and peering towards me. I saw now what I had not seen before, a sallow craft, the cunning of elfdom in his eyes. I knew him then for more than he seemed. A terror of his bread and butter seized upon me. I turned and fled up the woodland path towards the far-off blotch of sunlight that marked for me the safe normality of the open road. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Eloquent Signpost. At the top of the hill I came full upon a thing that drove this uncanny infant completely out of my mind, and at once sent me off hot foot on another adventure. It was only a signpost, and bore only 2 words, but these words brought back to me a history that once had filled all men's thoughts from end to end of the land. To Tichborne. It is not so wonderful that we should remember so many of the incidents of our childhood, as that childish memory should retain or discard on such a capricious and inconsequent plan. I must have been a very small boy indeed when the great Tichborne case stirred all men's minds and filled all newspapers. But, though it must have been a typically uninteresting thing to a child, the details of the case hold in my memory now with a strange clearness. This was, no doubt, due to the fact that every evening my father read out aloud the entire day's report of the trial, and I was forced to listen, and that in silence, held severely still in the lap of a maiden aunt. I was a devoted partisan of the claimant from the beginning. His friend and financier, Gilbert Onslow, took rank in my mind with Moses and David and Oliver Cromwell and all the other stalwart redressers of human wrongs. I would have kissed the dust from the boots of Dr. Kenealy and cheerfully burnt Lady Tichborne at the stake. But the great reason for my present joy at sight of the signpost has still to be told. In these now woefully distant days, I had registered a vow on the back cover of my Mavor's spelling book that I would see 3 places before I died. These 3 places were Jerusalem, New Orleans, and Tichborne. And here at last lay one of them on my direct line of route. I came down into Tichborne through some of the fairest woods and fattest pastures it had ever been my lot to behold. England, the old, merry, prosperous England, epitomised herself here in the land of lost Sir Roger, and the village itself was the true focus of it all. There was Tichborne House standing a little way off, deep in a maze of old apple trees, and girt about with an ancient red brick wall. There was the Tichborne Arms, crimson curtained, bright with new paint and polished window glass, where no doubt the retired butlers of centuries had laid up their comfortable bones. There was the square, grey, battlemented church, full, as I conceived, of Tichborne family monuments, and there were the little black and white thatched cottages grouped decorously and respectfully on the 2 sides of the winding village street, exhaling feudalism and snug dependence from every pore. I sat down by the village well to rest and smoke and reflect upon it all. I looked at the tidy street, the blooming gardens, the easy poverty and content of service that basked around me. I looked at the fine old family mansion, nestling like a prize hen among her plebeian chickens. I thought of the broad acres, the ducally rent roll, a whole countryside, as it were, eternally pulling its forelock and crooking its knee. And my hearty sympathy, or at least understanding, went out to covetous, clever Arthur Orton, and stood fraternally by him on that momentous day when, from his outpost in Alresford, he put together that deep scheme which, by so little, came to such utter naught. As I thus pondered, there arrived at the well an opulent-looking old gentleman in a smock and gaiters, bearing 2 pails on a milkman's yoke. He set these down with a clank, and proceeded to draw water, and I, for my part, desiring to draw information, helped him to wind up the rope. "Many's the bucket of water," said I, by way of preliminary, "that has journeyed up this dark lane since poor Arthur Orton's time." The old gentleman gave me a quick glance. Then he looked up the road and down the road, finally looking at me again. "Be ye visitin' at the great house?" he asked cautiously. "Oh no, I'm only a stranger passing through." "Well now," he came a step nearer. "Look'ee here a minute." He came quite close. "I'll tell 'ee somewhat." He half whispered the words into my ear. "Arthur Orton, there never were no sech person. Arthur Orton, don't 'ee get talkin' of that to the old folk hereabout, or you'll soon have a straight word from the shoulder. 'Twere poor Sir Roger, his very own self, and no other soul in the world, so help me Lord." He said it as though he were making a solemn affidavit, and having said it, he drew back to study its effect. But see now, I always believed in him as you do. Yet, when he came out of prison, he wrote the whole story for the papers, confessing that he was Arthur Orton and the entire thing a fraud. How do you get over that? The old gentleman smiled incredulously. "I were paid to do it. I were an old man and a poor man. I were broke in mind and body. And here were a bit of money to be had. No blame to un either. I did it because I were paid to do it, I tell 'ee." But they would have paid just as much for Tichborne's story as for Arthur Orton's story. They only wanted the truth, you know. He smiled more incredulously than ever. "See yer, whoever ye be, I knowed young Sir Roger, a proper wild lad as ever drew breath. I mind well when I went away to foreign parts, and I seed un many's the time when I come back, and they yonder tried to fix it on un as I were Arthur Orton. But I knowed un, I tell 'ee, and as old nurse knowed un, as they clapped into the madhouse purty quick to shut her mouth like. But you might both have been mistaken. Sir Roger went away a boy, and the one who came back, claiming to be Sir Roger Tichborne, was a man well on in life, and a hard life too. Even if it had really been Sir Roger, he must have been entirely altered, and you could hardly have known his face." The old gentleman regarded me with scorn now, as well as incredulity. "His face? I never 'lowed as I knowed his face, nor no one else didn't. 'Twas the words as proved the man. Listen now. I comes up to inn yonder. 'Twere the same man keeping it, look ye, as I went away. 'Hello,' says he, 'you've moved a picture from that there wall, as I used to be very fond o'. A fine picture in a gold frame, and with gold all over the back. What's come to it?' says he. Sure as I stands here, the very same picture were in the house still, and there were the gold back, just as I said. Another thing now, I went riding, maybe with Mr. Onslow, as stood his friend through thick and thin, and lost £18,000 by it. They was riding along together, and says Sir Roger, sudden like, 'Ah, there used to be a gate here, as many a time I've rode through, just here where the bushes is growed up.' Arterwards they dug up the place, and sure as I live, there was the stumps of the old gate posts underground, buried and forgotten. What might ye say to that?" There was nothing to be said, and he went on. "Ay, I could tell ye stories, and the old woman get no water from now to carol time. But this'n 'll finish ye. Sir Roger a come through a old garden hereby, and says he, pointin', 'See that tree? I planted that tree, I did, with my own hands years afore I went away. And what d'ye think I put underneath the root on it? I put a girt big stone there, and there you'll find it still. And sure as ye has eyes to your face, find it they did, just as he told 'em. Ay, I were poor Sir Roger right enow, and no other living soul." That noon I lunched at the Tichborne Arms as a right and a bounden duty. The wind was still blowing hard and cold in my face when I took the road again, but the country was so charming that I paid little heed to this. The whole afternoon was just a pleasant saunter from one pretty village to another, through low-lying but infinitely diversified scenery. Towards sundown, however, I got tired of the winding white lanes and the face of man, and, yielding to a sudden fit of vagabondage, climbed over the nearest gate, making straight ahead through a vista of trackless green pastures, the ruddy light full in my eyes. It was wanton, flagrant trespass, no doubt, and therein both culpable and irresistible. I went, as it were, with my life in my hand, through an enemy's country, and every step was fraught with a sweet peril. I began the tramp as a mere scout, but the fancy rapidly developed. After I had scrambled through half a dozen hedges, crossed a field of rape, and breasted a hazel copse or two, I promoted myself to the moccasins of leather stocking. Thence, on coming to a sunny bit of valley full of lowing milch kine, with a patch of red farmstead in the middle, it was an easy change to one of the spies in Canaan. But I was still to play my star part. I skirted the valley unseen, swung myself across a brook by means of an overhanging ash branch, then, finding myself on the brink of a wild forest country, I got me on the Lincoln jerkin of Robin Hood. I was tired enough of that character and of this particular merry greenwood before I was done with them. For the first half hour I moved in a very aureola of romance. It were easy to believe that no human foot had ever trodden that mossy path before. Far ahead the saffron of the sunset glittered through the trees. Above me the oaks made a close-knit russet canopy, and behind there was the blue night coming up hand over hand like a dusky enemy in pursuit. Rabbits broke continually across the path. Hares ran on ahead, or played in the quiet glades to left and right of me. The deep bugle call of pheasants went to and fro in the wood. Everywhere there was the last sleepy twittering of the birds as they settled to roost. But soon the rich light, for which I was steering, paled and lowered. The darkness gained upon, and overran, and past me. At length it filled all the wood. A ground mist sprang up, so that I could scarce see the trend of the path a dozen feet away. And still, against the thin scarlet line that divided the darkness of earth and sky, the tree tops crowded one behind the other, and every furlong I covered seemed to reveal unnumbered and impenetrable leagues ahead. Starlight has always an alluring poetic flavour about it, and when there is a hard road underfoot, and he is sure of his way, the traveller need ask for no brighter company. But in the midst of a wood of unknown extent, with night long since fallen, and hunger and fatigue dogging his heels, a full moon and plenty of milestones are more to his purpose. The stars and the last dull patch in the west were, however, all I had to guide me that night, and a good hour went by before the trees began to thin about me, and I came out at last upon an open way. Here the woods ended, and the country fell away abruptly beneath. I stopped at the first clear point of outlook, and scanned the dark gulf below. To my great joy, I saw a little blur of lights close at hand, and as I trudged down the steep lane towards it, a church clock struck, denoting a village of some extent. 10 minutes later I reached the place. As far as I could make out in the darkness, it was as pretty as anything I had ever seen. The church stood in the midst of it, the street dividing and curving round each side of the graveyard. Without, there was almost a complete circle of houses, all facing towards the church. Some fine old elms towered up against the stars on the north side. I heard the drumming of water over a weir not far off, but I was too tired and hungry to concern myself much over its beauties then. I unshipped my rucksack and set about the task of looking for board and bed. I made the round of the place twice before I spied a queer little cottage standing somewhat back from the street. The door of it stood open, giving a view of the lighted interior, and every now and then a strange cry drifted out upon the still night air that at once attracted my attention. "Rain a-comin', Joe!" The words were uttered in a harsh, strident, mocking voice, though perfectly distinct. I ought to have known them at once for a parrot's, yet it was not until I had listened and heard them repeated 3 or 4 times over that this explanation of the curious cry occurred to me, and then I loitered up to the door and casually glanced in. There was a little round table spread for a meal. There was a glowing wood fire, before which sat a very small white-headed old man on a 3-legged stool, placidly toasting bacon. On his shoulder perched the parrot, a mass of internecine colour, blue and scarlet and green, and all around him, fixed to the walls, sheathed in the corners or displayed on the mantelpiece, were countless weapons of war, but every one of a savage kind: assegais, knobkerries, hideous curved scimitars and knives, an old matchlock or two fantastically ornamented with beads. All this I took in at a first glance, and then found myself staring into the little old man's face, and he into mine. For he had suddenly turned and discovered me. I did not delay an explanation. "I was just passing," said I, "and heard your parrot calling out. What a voice there is to him! But he is wrong this time. By the look of the night, it cannot rain for weeks." This rather deft resort to the side issue was perfectly successful. I could see at once that my rudeness of intrusion was in a fair way of being forgiven and even forgotten. The old man smiled wisely. Then he stuck his tongue into his lower lip, craftily blinking both eyes. "Rain a-comin', Joe!" The old man fondled the screaming gewgaw into silence. "Ah," said he, with ineffable meaning. "Ah, do ye say that? Now, I'll tell ye what I'll do. I'll wager my Sunday coat as it'll rain hard afore mornin', for all your fine nights. Now then." He landed the fizzling bacon into a dish at his side, and began on another rasher. "'Tis like this," he went on. "Ye heerd and cried Joe. My name bean't Joe. 'Twere my old father, as were a sea captain and a great traveller. Brought home all these here stickers and clubs and things, and the parrot were his'n, and him and the parrot they sailed many a voyage together. I larned the parrot a sight of things, and the parrot, landee, more's the pity. But one thing the parrot knowed of his own self better'n my father, though 'a were 50 year on the sea. I knowed the weather upside and downside. If I set to callin', wind a comin', Joe, there was all hands to shorten the sail directly minute, and so 'twere with the rain, and so 'tis still. I tell 'ee I can't be beat." The old man had talked himself into such a condition of glowing bonhomie that I ventured now on the thing that had been uppermost in my own thoughts. I explained to him my position, and asked him if he could tell me where I could find a lodging for the night. He thought it over a while. "Would just a little small cupboard o' a room, not no size at all, content ye anyhow?" I told him I should be glad of the simplest accommodation. "And just a bite o' common wittles, such as a lone widder man 'ud do wi'? That's all I want in the world." "Then bide along o' me," he said, and put more bacon on the spit. Chapter 22 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Song Before Sunrise. It was towards daybreak, but still dark as pitch, when I woke in my little cupboard room under the thatch, and at once threw off all the bedclothes. It had turned stifling hot while I slept. I had set the window open as far as it would go, and overnight the room had been perfectly sweet and cool, but now it was hot and close as an oven. And all round the little house I could hear the rain pouring down, a steady thudding note on the thatch overhead, and below a sound as of countless rills and freshets babbling joyously together as they coursed along the street. I got out of bed, and kneeling down by the little square hole of a window, crowded head and shoulders through. The air outside was just like a draught of hot spiced wine. The warm rain seemed to have liberated 1,000 odours from the parched earth. In the dense shrubbery of the churchyard opposite, I could make out a dim crepitation and stir of life, as though every twig and branch was stretching itself gladly and expanding its cold cramped fibres in the new warmth and wet. Towards the east there was a grey patch coming in the darkness, and now in the thicket of yew and laurel a thrush began to pipe, such a pipe as I had not heard for many a long day. It was just like tears of molten silver dropping through the darkness, tears born of joy, for the thrush's song is never sad. What makes the first bird sing in the dawn? I have often wondered. You can understand the earliest pearl grey light kindling a common gladness through the woods. This happens every morning in the year, when there is a touch of south in the breeze, and when summer is at her zenith, the woodlarks sing all night through, and then it is only a case of the lightest sleeper first awakened. But in season or out of season there is always one bird, and this ever a thrush, that feels the day coming before its fellows. My thrush in the churchyard sang alone. As yet it was so dark that I could see nothing beyond the dripping eaves of the thatch, but a silhouette of tree tops, black against the livid eastern sky. The rain soused down harder than ever, straight vertical rods of water that, reaching the hard road, broke into a fine white mist just discernible in the gloom below. But neither storm nor darkness made any odds to the singer. He piped on with a reckless energy, as though he believed the coming of the day depended entirely on the power of his magic flute. It was a robin that first heard this glad reveille. There came 2 or 3 half-hearted apologetic trills from the depths of the nearest bush, and then, apparently, he tucked his head under his other wing and slumbered again, for I heard no more of him. But now the grey light was mounting apace. Nothing in feathers could sleep, surely, in the fair way of that torrent of music. One by one other thrushes joined in. Chaffinches began to clink in the thicket. The note of a bullfinch, like a quick, short breath over the top of a key, went about from bush to bush. I could hear the starlings clucking and whistling on the roof ridge of the church, and, close to my ear, the sparrows were creeping, like mice out of their holes in the thatch, and already quarrelling noisily. At length, still leaning through the tiny window, I guessed by the broadening light that the sun was up. But, at best, it was only a bolder twilight, for the sky was great with cloud, and the rain pelted down with a grimmer determination than ever. I now heard the old cottager moving in the room below me, and I hastened to dress. I found him occupied in exactly the same way as I had discovered him the night before, sitting on the three-legged stool and toasting bacon, with the parrot clambering about on his shoulder. The old man turned me a triumphant face as I came in. "Look at that now," said he, pointing to the streaming window glass. "What did I tell ye? As fine a rain as ever come out of heaven." His enthusiasm easily transcended my own. The last thing I had done before leaving Winchester had been to send my waterproofs on by post, judging them to be only a useless encumbrance in the sunshine that seemed by then invincible. At the time I had plumed myself on my foresight as much as I now regretted it. But repining would not mend the matter. It looked as though I had a long wet day to face, and I must contrive against it as best I could. We sat down to the meal, and the three of us, the old man, the parrot, and I, held a council of war together. "I must go on," said I at last, "though I do not want to get wet. Is there no covered waggon or cart going my way this morning?" The old man slapped his thigh. "Aye, there be Bilot, that there be," he cried, only just remembering it. "Bilot the carrier, as comes through on's road to Petersfield every Tuesday. You're in luck, 'tis the very day." No sooner had he said it than we heard a steady scrunching of wheels in the street, and my host darted out to interview the carrier. While he was gone, and I was getting my traps together, the parrot, who throughout the meal had been merely whistling or indulging in irrelevant seafaring profanity, now found his voice to a new strain. "Storm and shine, Joe! Storm and shine! Storm and shine!" I looked at the leaden sky and the unremitting deluge, and felt this to be an exasperating foul indeed. Shine, I thought to myself disconsolately. It will never shine again. But his master, who then returned, had no sooner heard the new cry than he was exclaiming again at my luck. "As all is right," said he. "'Twill clear within the hour, sure as big taters come from little uns." I consulted Bilot on this point when presently we were journeying on together, and discovered in him a great curiosity, to wit, an outdoor man who honestly confessed himself ignorant on the subject of weather. Bilot sat on the front board and talked back over his shoulder to me, while I sat under the waggon tilt behind, snugly out of reach of the rain. The old grey horse, his ears back and his head lowered to the deluge, splashed on before us at a steady 4 miles an hour. "Parrots?" quoth Bilot indignantly. "What call ha' they foreign animals a comin' here and layin' down the law o' things, when our own old rooks and crows knows nought about it? And they bred and born in the place. Ye never can tell the rights o' it from one hour to the next in this country. What's afore your eyes, that ye knows and no more. 'Tis rainin' at this very minute. Put out your hand and ye feels it. Now look away yonder. What might ye make o' that?" I stared along his pointing whip handle. There was an undeniable patch of blue coming in the grey. It looked as though the parrot were right after all, and, with much diffidence, I suggested this to Bilot. "Parrot or no parrot," he maintained stoutly, "ye never can tell. 'Tis even heads or tails all the time. If it don't rain or shine, 'twill gloam, and more no livin' man, let alone green and yaller furren beast, can say." However, in a little while the rattle of the rain on the waggon tilt ceased. A wisp of watery sunshine came racing over the meadows towards us, revealing the fact that there had been no rain at all, but just a mighty downfall of diamonds, which now rimmed and spangled everything with their changing, iridescent light. Thus heartened, I began to take an interest in the world once more. "You are going to Petersfield?" I asked the carrier. That's almost due south, isn't it?" "Ah. What is this place we are going down into now?" "Selborne." "What?" I cried, jumping up in the cart. "So 'tis. Maybe ye never heerd on it. 'Tis but a little small place." I hastily got out my map. There was no doubt about it. I was back in Selborne, the Selborne of Gilbert White, after an absence of 20 years. I parted company with Bilot then, and let him go on ahead. When the grating of his waggon wheels had died away at the bottom of the hill, I set about making my own breath-baited entry into the place alone. I think I shall never go to Selborne again as long as I live. Indeed, it is no longer possible to go there except by one road, that of the wise, calm, imperishable book. All other ways are closed, the very village itself obliterated by the glacier-like march of money. Evil days of prosperity have fallen upon the place. It is indescribably swept and garnished. The old, rough, hollow lanes have disappeared, and beautifully engineered thoroughfares set to lure the charabancs. Rich folk have settled on Selborne thick as flies. There are shops that would not disgrace a back street in Balham. With my pack and miry boots and well-worn clothes, I felt like a suspicious character, as much out of place as a pickpocket in Rotten Row. I pushed on between the immaculate show cottages of the village street, past White's old parsonage, now apparently somebody's country house, and out on the sunny Plestor, the ancient playing place of Selborne. Another big shop stared at me here from a neighbouring corner, but otherwise, to my great delight, the place was unchanged. There was the old tree in its centre, with the seat round it, just such another tree and seat as must have stood there in White's day. Between the cobblestones the mayweed raised its well-remembered feathery fronds, and by the churchyard wall roses still bloomed, though it was mid-November, just the same loose pink roses gently swaying on curving wands of green that I had sentimentalised over so many years ago. I raised the latch of the churchyard gate and passed in. That is a hard word I have just written, but, I suppose, a true one. Looking back on it now, through the vista of 20 sane and sobering years, the pilgrimage I then made to the shrine of Gilbert White stands out as nothing less than an orgy of sentimentalism. That it was so, sincerely and unconsciously, that my every thought and act at the time was a pure, unforced affair of the heart, and no designed conceit, only aggravates the case. No writer nor draftsman, I think, comes to the fullness of his powers, whatever they may be, quite by the same devious paths, the same tilting at windmills, the exploiting of the same blind alleys. Yet all have to look back on much the same reiterated felo de se, the piling by the way of those dead selves that lead, or so often do not lead, to higher things. On that never to be forgotten day, when I first came to Selborne churchyard to look for the grave of Gilbert White, I went straight to the most gorgeous monument I could see, believing, in those callow times, that the greatest dead always lay in the fairest tombs. But to-day I knew better where to seek him. In the quietest, leafiest corner, almost the humblest among the crowding graves, I found and stood by the stone again, noting how the ivy still wreathed about it, and the moss and lichens shrouded it in golden green. G.W. 26 June 1793. There was nothing else upon the stone, and even these simple letters were hardly to be deciphered for the splaying lichens. I looked at it a while silently, then turned away, and, as I turned, the sunlight paled and was gone. The wind dirged faintly in the old grey church tower. Over the hanging woods a rain cloud dragged its grisly curtain, and drove me helter-skelter to the haven of the inn. Here, while the storm went by, I sat over a pipe and a mug of Hampshire brew, conning the visitors' books, the new gilt-lettered one, and the old dog-eared books, whose entries go back 30 years or more. All manner of men have made this pilgrimage to Selborne. I found Huxley's name here in '89, and with it that of Lord Napier. The signatures of other men, almost as distinguished, cropped up here and there in the time-stained page, and they are still coming daily, and will come, I suppose, while love of the great truths of nature, interpreted by great art, still forms part of the mind equipment of the world's great men. The rain kept up its tattoo on the window glass, and, for want of other occupation, I went on turning the well-thumbed leaves. The books were full of names and the commentaries of people from all ends and beginnings of the earth. It was only to be expected that Selborne would prove, for gushing enthusiasts, a lodestar of nearly equal magnitude with Stratford-on-Avon. And here they were, hundreds of them, all self-written down after the name of their kind. Opening the book at random, this thing first caught my eye. A cold and frosty morning, all nature robed in white. Shade of Gilbert, forgive the unpremeditated pun. What manner of man could have written it, I wondered, and passed idly on. My next halt was at a couplet in blank verse, original, I should judge. And I said, if there's peace in this world to be found, a heart that is humble might hope for it here. Only some wag had erased all the aspirates in the second line, and somewhat marred the effect. On every page almost, ignorance had set down some such nauseating outburst in praise of either the man, the book, or the place. Let these stand for example. White's History of Selborne would do for the diary of Adam in Eden. Selborne is the earthly paradise of beauty. One forgets all the sin and sorrow of the world in this divinely lovely place. And again, what a boon to the jaded human toiler, such a man of genius, such an immortal book, and such a ravishingly beautiful spot of earth. But the mass of trite twaddle was not without its leavening of humour here and there. One traveller, arriving on a blusterous day, and desiring to record some incident, evidently witnessed on the road, writes or quotes as follows: The divil he sent a great high wind, which blew her skirts sky high, but the good Lord sent a cloud of dust, which lodged in the bad man's eye. Some busybody, also, had added to the usual adulatory passage about Selborne a condensed biography of Gilbert White, in which he stated that White was vicar of the place. Under this, in another hand, was written, "This writer is mistaken. Gilbert White was never vicar of Selborne. It was his father who held this post." In yet another handwriting, and under another date, we read, "You are both mistaken. The White who figures on the parish registers as sometime vicar of Selborne was really the grandfather of the immortal Gilbert." This was evidently too much for the patience and good sense of another traveller, who came later. For a fourth note is scribbled under the other three. "You are all wrong. It was his grandmother." The storm passed as swiftly as it came. Now the sunshine filled the little room with its sudden gladness, and revealed to me that I was sitting in a fog of stale dust motes, when a couple of strides would bring me out into pure clean air. I took my way down the sloppy, glittering street, looking about me at the beech-clad hills that hem in the place, the rich meadows, the fine view eastward over Walmer Forest, murky blue and mist-laden now in the showery times. The country round Selborne is undoubtedly pretty, and on that changing, glamorous morning it must have looked well nigh at its best. But even when viewed under all favour and advantage, it is impossible to concede to Selborne the supremacy claimed for it by those unblushing and unbalanced scribes. If there had never been a Gilbert White, I doubt if a single one of these laudatory gentry, in making a tour of this part of Hampshire, would have stopped a day in the place, or singled it out as anything above its fellows. And therein, if we come to consider it, lies the highest word of praise that can be bestowed on Selborne's immortal chronicler. The very fact that Selborne, though pretty, is not especially beautiful, shows us the man in his true light. White's genius, and not its own peculiar merit, has made all men proclaim Selborne as the fairest of earthly Edens, which, assuredly, it is not. for Providence seldom wastes her richest human material on superlatives. He of the one talent may be sent to the mountain tops, but the million-faceted soul is kept to labour in the universe of common everyday. It was the great privilege of Gilbert White to live in the midst of normality. He wrote not of an unmatched paradise, but of a stretch of country that was just a type of rural England, no more and no less. That he found in it beauty and truth illimitable is matter in praise, not of Selborne, but of the great beauty and truth giver, whose will it is that these good things should be set in humble ways. We should still have had the Natural History and the yet finer Calendar if, instead of in Selborne, Gilbert White had been destined to live and work on Peckham Rye. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Heigh-Ho for the wind and the rain. Thanks to my early start from the Parrot Cottage, the morning was still young. It was barely 11 o'clock when I left Selborne and pushed on at a good pace, designing to make what progress I could while the fair interval of weather lasted. I had also another motive, which, with me, counted easily first. I knew Selborne lay only 6 miles from the Sussex border. It is with the Sussex man as with the Scot. He can be happy enough in other lands, if sufficiently far away, but bring him within measurable distance of his native down or heather, and he is all eagerness to get them under his feet. It was the instinct of the homing pigeon that awoke in me then, and for the next few miles urged me onward. The bright spell between the showers served to carry me through Empshot, over the main Farnham and Petersfield road, and some way into the wild and lonely forest country beyond. I got a lift in a farm waggon just clear of Selborne, and another in the pony trap of a coal porter farther on, and I was in full enjoyment of a novel experience, riding astride of an enormous beech trunk on a timber trolley, with 4 steaming horses thunderously tramping on in single line before me, when the black sky seemed to split asunder and let down a solid mass of water. The woodman, trudging on beside his leading horse, took no heed of the downfall, but, for myself, I was in no mind to sit there and drown. I slipped off my perch to the ground, and crowded into the shelter of the wayside trees that here grew thick and close. I was to learn, as it proved, a great deal about rain before that day was over. The roadside bank was sandy and hollow, and over-roofed by the spreading oak branches. Not a drop reached me where I stood. I had nothing, therefore, to do but wait and study the thing before me. The shower was short, but never, I verily believe, had it rained before as it rained then. Everything in my view was blotted out by the descending cataract. The sound of its falling was like the continuous roar of an angry sea. The water fell black on the road before me, springing up instantly a yard high in a milk-white mist of spray. Though the deluge could not reach me under the bank, a stream of water began to flow round my feet, so that I must dig out footholds in the sandy wall, and partly by these, partly by clinging on to the roots above, I must lift myself, as best I could, out of the charging freshet. And then, as suddenly as it came, the storm cloud drove by on the south-west wind. The sunlight poured out of the heaven. I took the road once more, the only dry thing in the whole smiling, ruddy wilderness. I bethought me, however, as I went along, that but for the kindly shelter of the bank, I might have been as wet as the dripping foliage above me, and I resolved to provide against another such chance. About a mile farther on, I came up with a solitary little inn, with a stable yard at its side, at the gate of which stood the ostler, a lean and melancholy wight, cocking lack-lustre eye to the weather. By this time it had fallen grey again, and another shower seemed imminent. I went up to this ostler, full of an idea that now occurred to me. "Do you think," said I, "you could find me an old driving cape, or anything that will keep out the water? Something that I can throw away when I get to the end of my journey?" He received this in blank astonishment, and as he stared at me, the rain came flooding down again. "Come inside," said he, still looking at me as if I were the most amazing phenomenon in his experience. "I dunno, an old cape, did you say? Well now, maybe as I could. Would an old top coat serve ye anyways?" He produced the coat. It was a coachman's coat in stout boxcloth, and had once been of a rich chocolate brown, but was now faded to a nondescript clay colour. It had facings of buff, and some of its big-horn buttons still clung to it. It fitted me, and to spare. I looked round the harness room. "Now give me some of that old tarpaulin, enough to make leggins with, and a cover for the camera." By the help of a knife and some string this was soon effected. Outside the rain was coming down, not in temporary wrath as before, but with a steady swing to it, as though it had set in for the day. I took another searching look round the room. "Can I have that?" It was an ancient stiff felt hat, round topped and with ample brim, the very thing to ward off the elements. I pocketed my cap and set off through the rain, a couple of shillings poorer in purse, but richer by an equipment that, saving thunderbolts, was proof against all malignancies of weather. One among the most illustrious of our fiction mongers has given us a phrase that deserves, if it may not achieve immortality. Having plunged his characters over head and ears in a slough of disaster, he gives the problem up, and, standing aside, inveighs against the perfidy of circumstance. That things work together for good or ill, apart from human volition, must be more than suspected by any careful student of life, and I was now to find in myself an apt confirmation of this. When I first set out on my roving excursion through the 5 counties, nothing had been farther from my thoughts than to attempt any disguises. But circumstances, whether perfidious or benevolent, had now led me into this very thing. Without any preconcerted design of my own, there I was, trudging along the King's Highway, as seedy and dilapidated a tramp as might be found in the kingdom. From looking the part to acting it was not, I found, so great a step as it appeared. I had hardly covered another mile before I felt the slouching gait and the hangdog look of the peripatetic casual breaking out all over me. By the time I got to Rake, which stands on the Sussex border, the rain had put the finishing touch to my disguise, and I set foot on my native soil at last, waterlogged and mud bespattered, a happy and frankly irredeemable vagabond. In this picturesque array of mind and body I wandered on for the rest of the day, caring nothing for the rain, caring only that the ground beneath my feet was good Sussex ground, and that every step now brought me nearer and nearer to that green downland heart of it, where lay my own roof tree and home. The fierce gusty spell of weather was over. A thick white fog had come up on the dropping breeze, and through this there fell a constant drizzle that neither increased nor abated, but steadily did its worst until the night. And yet every mile I covered under these unhelpful conditions was full of a real traveller's joy. The old coat and the tarpaulin leggins and that precious hat, whose willowy brim shot the water off a good 3 inches on either side, kept me perfectly dry. The woods and hedgerows about me rang with the happy songs of birds, rejoicing in the new warmth that had transformed the whole countryside. I could see nothing of the landscape for the enveloping mist, but I knew my own homeland lay about me, and, in fancy, I surrounded the way with the richest and most inspiring scenery, and bethought me all the time of the hidden sun above. I got no more lifts that day. No one offers to lift the professional tramp, and I found my garb so effective that not only did the ordinary traffic of the road pass me by without a look, but the very labourers I met withheld their common greetings. In the villages I encountered the same almost surly ostracism everywhere. People turned away from their doors as I passed. In the tap room of the inn where I lunched, the landlord kept possession of the pot of ale and bread and cheese which I had ordered, until the money for them was safely in his hand. In one place a constable maintained me severely under his eye, following me at a distance until I had slouched my way out of his jurisdiction. All through that rainy, mist-shrouded afternoon I spoke with only 2 human creatures. The first was a ragged, hulking fellow, whom I overtook on the road, and who insisted on bearing me company. But I found his conversation so foul and his general outlook on life so malodorous that I soon gave him a decisive good day and forged on ahead. The only other fellow creature with whom I held parley was a road mender. I came upon him towards late afternoon in a little hamlet called Elstead, lying, though I never suspected it then, in the enveloping mist, close under the first bluff escarpment of the Sussex Downs. He was a serene old man with bow legs and mild blue eyes, and he seemed to have the village to himself, save that, from the little schoolhouse hard by, there came the low tumult of children's voices. I stopped really to listen to this pleasant rivulet of sound, stemming out upon the dismal twilight. But the old man mistook the action. He gave over scraping in the gutter, and looked cheerfully my way. "Travellin', be ye?" said he with a pleasant nod. In his voice there was a kind, hearty ring that strangely affected me. It was the first genial word and look I had received for many a long hour. I drew a little nearer. "Yes, I've come a long way, and it's hard going in the rain. Have you seen many of my sort passing through to day?" He thought a little, his chin on the handle of his hoe. "No," said he at length, "plenty o' other sorts, but nane o' your sort." "What sort do you take me to be, then?" He hesitated, and I could see he was casting about for a gentle way to put it. "Ah," he said presently, chopping away at the weeds again, "trouble comes, and comes to high and low. I ha' seed it, and I knows. Jedge not, and ye won't be jedged. That's what I allers says." This somehow nettled me. I was willing to pass as an out and out incorrigible tramp, but to be taken for a broken down gentleman had in it a mysterious quality of offence. I wondered whether it would have hurt me at all, or hurt me more, if my case had been as he suspected. "Where does that road lead to?" I asked him. He shook the water from his hat. "That there? That goes by Steddham on to Midhurst. 'Twill be your road, I reckon." "Why my road?" I could see he was in a difficulty again. "Well, now, they others, they mostly asks for that way." "For Midhurst?" "Aye." He stopped, and then surprised me by flushing red to his hat brim. "Midhurst, you know, the labourin' house. No offence, mister, I do hope, that I do." We were both in the same confusion now. "No," said I, "I'm not thinking of going there to night. I hate towns. Where does that other road take you to?" "That 'un? Through Bepton to Cockin. Purty nigh 4 mile 'tis. But ye're a smartish bit wet a'ready, mister, bean't ye?" I told him I was dry enough underneath, whereupon, by no means misunderstanding me, he nevertheless went to his basket that was tucked under the ivy of the school wall, and drew forth a tin bottle. "'Tis home brewed," he said, "and you're very welcome. Water you've had to day and to spare, so a change o' liquor won't harm ye." I drank gratefully to the fine, sensitive souled old man, devoutly hoping that there were many more like him in the land. And, as I drank, there came from the schoolhouse behind me a flood of what seemed then the most exquisite music. All the children were singing together an evening hymn. "Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening steal across the sky." At the sound of it the old road scraper began to gather up his tools. "Hark ye," he said smiling, "I 'lows that's about the last touch. School'll be up in a minute, and I'll be getting home along." He walked with me to the corner. Here, as I was turning away, he put a fatherly hand on my sleeve. "See now," said he, "I don't rightly know how 'tis wi' ye, but, come night time, if ye turns in to sleep anywheres, in a barn or the like, mind well as ye ask leave of the farmer first, else there might be trouble for ye. They're terrible sharp hereabouts." But I was in no mood for that kind of adventure. Already the darkness was looming up behind me, and the rain as inexorable as ever. By the time I reached Cocking I was heartily sick and tired of vagabondage. Just clear of the village, I took off coat and hat and leggings, and rolling them up together, threw them over the nearest gate. 10 minutes later I was toasting my wet boots before a cottage fire, listening all at once to the sizzle of a point steak in a frying pan, the talk of a 90-year-old grandfather, and the prattle of a child who had climbed upon my knee. My luck was in again. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Last Lift Home. I took a last look back at Cocking from the top of the hill. Under my feet there was the thymy grass of the South Downs. A little way down the steep slope, thin parallel lines of white began, sheep ruts that had been there for ages. These gradually broadened and multiplied until, a quarter of a mile from where I stood, they formed a homogeneous track, and then a hard white road, which wound down and lost itself among the red roofs of the village. What a day, I thought to myself, for the last day of my journey. All sign of yesterday's unkindly mood had vanished. A sky of unsullied azure stretched above my head. There was not enough breeze to move a star of thistledown. The sunshine wantoned around me, and somewhere above, everywhere in very truth, and nowhere that I could certainly discover, larks were singing in one unbroken flow of music. True Sussex downland lark music, not to be matched by any other in the length and breadth of the land. There was a veneer of dew upon the grass, white and sparkling like frosted silver. I slung my boots to my shoulder and strode on barefooted and bareheaded through the sweet morning air. A regiment of greenfinches chippered on before me from bush to bush. Linnets made a slender tweeting in the gorse brakes. Far overhead, a great company of jackdaws sailed by. Rabbits struck across the path incessantly. My feet broke the gossamer at every stride, and, looking backward, there lay my trail as far as I could see, a double string of green ovals bruised in the shining white. Here the downs soar far into the blue sky, 400 or 500 feet perhaps, and maintain this altitude almost unbroken for miles. It was my design to keep to the hilltops, going always eastward, until hunger should drive me down into the valley again, whether to north or south it mattered not a jot. But as yet the day was only in its first fresh glow of youth and beauty. The whole morning lay before me, in which to renew my ancient joy in these glad solitudes. I pushed onward, breasting the hot sweet air and sunshine, drinking in the fragrance and the melody that earth and sky were interchanging, wondering what would happen to a man whose entire life could be passed, forgotten and forgetful of all other human beings, here on the green roof tree of the world. It will hardly have escaped the vigilance, nor perhaps the censure, of the reader that, in this chronicle, I have had much the same difficulty with sheep bells as Mr. Dick with King Charles's head. On such a journey this was inevitable. The music of the sheep bells formed almost as common a part of my daily fare as the bread I ate, and was well nigh as indispensable. The old bee master cannot live far from the song of his hives, nor can the Sussex downlander endure for long the neighbourhood of hill and dale bereft of his native bell music. If you do not know the deep satisfaction inherent in either of these things, well, you do not know, and there is an end to it. But constantly, at odd turns of the way, and at odd moments when there was nothing farther from my mind, The old familiar sound would peal out, welcome as sunshine in the midst of a shadowed day. And if there is a page here without its sheep bells, it is because I put a discreetly muffling hand upon them, not because the soft heart-quickening music failed, then in fact, or now in memory. On these green heights, and far below in the violet-misted combes, I came upon many flocks of sheep, and the bells were never out of hearing all the morning through. No sooner had one clanging chorus died away, than I began to draw into the zone of another symphony. 3 hours and more I wandered along those green rampart tops, and there was never a moment but had its dying cadence just at the ear's stretch far behind, or its new bell song lifting faintly out of some gilded hollow still to traverse. I had asked myself what manner of man would be evolved by such an environment, perpetuated throughout a whole lifetime, and I had but to look around me at the shepherds as they loitered over their highland pastures, crook in hand and dog at heel. When you first go a rambling in the South Down country, you are like to be brought up early and sharply by an astounding yet indisputable thing. Yourself may have met with no living creature for an hour or more, and, coming into some secret hollow of the hills, where a shepherd leans upon his crook, his sheep feeding before him, you reflect that here is a man who, in all likelihood, has been alone since dawn. He must be starving for companionship. The mere sound of a human voice will be to him meat and drink. Of your charity you go out of the way to exchange a word with him in his loneliness, as you would feel constrained to give the cup of cold water to a beggar at your door. Your confidence then is as profound, as will be your bewilderment a moment later. For this poor solitary, far from rejoicing at your advent, receives you with the plainest and coolest unconcern. Calm-eyed, deliberate of speech, studiously civil, he yet conveys to you at once and unmistakably that he values your room as much as your fellowship. He returns your greeting courteously enough. All your advances have their due rejoinder, but plainly he had been just as well pleased if you had passed by in the distance with a mere wave of the hand. Plainly nothing had so well contented him now as that you should be gone and leave him to his sheep and empty hills and clamouring doors. This peculiarity is all but universal among the shepherds of the South Downs. Down in the lowlands, ploughman or carter or stockman, they are all glad and ready to pass the time of day with you, and give you back sally for sally to your heart's content. Their work seems to beget the same craving for intercourse as human work needs all the world over. But there is something in the life of a downland shepherd that makes him mentally independent of his fellows. He is alone, but obviously he loves to be alone. Invariably he is a man of thought, but his thoughts are his own thoughts, and he neither desires to share them with another, nor to get your views at second hand. He will stop up on those bare hills from dawn till dusk, and then, if he goes to the inn after folding time, he will sit and smoke his pipe, the most silent and least interested member of the company. Somehow or other he gets his daily fill of whatever it is that urges all other human creatures, the very beasts and birds even, to comradeship, and feels no farther need. It is a subtle and evasive problem. The shepherd's is a calling that descends from father to son, generation after generation, and heredity may have evolved a special, self-sufficient man for this most solitary and exacting task. But consider what is the chief influence that surrounds and pervades the work of the South Down shepherd. We all know the power of music on heart and mind. Of music as an art science I am not qualified to speak. The word to me has no significance beyond its grouping of tones into simple melody, or wild unrhythmic concourses of sweet sound. And probably, to the great body of the naturally educated, it is the power of suggestion in music, rather than its didacticism, that counts in the scheme of a progressive world. In my own case, let it stand for self-condemnation if you will, I have listened to the more abstruse Wagnerianisms unenlightened, not a little bewildered, while the sound of a barrel organ playing Swanee River in the distance has straightway opened for me the very gates of paradise. Consider then that the South Down shepherd, boy and youth and man, has passed his life amid the unceasing music of the sheep bells. Consider that one rich, wavering peal of this same music, drifting over the wind-washed hills, will bring a glow to your cheek and set all your thoughts into unheard of happy trespassing. And then consider what must happen to a man, sensitive, skilful, of a sturdy originality of mind, for the craft of shepherding demands all these and more, whose daily work anchors him in the very midst of this influence, and holds him there with little more to do than yield himself to its incessant prompting, no less powerful because unsuspected and unfelt. The wonder is that the shepherd class has given us so few poets and imaginative writers. But the shepherd is nature's child, and the natural human instinct is to make of thought an end in itself. It goes no farther than speech at most. It was well after noon when I began to cast hungry looks over the steep hillsides for any sign of a village that might contain an inn. I came down northward into the Weald again by much the same sort of road as I had left it at Cocking. But here the track descended through hanging beech woods, now almost destitute of leaves. Hazel copses bare to the searching sunbeams, hedgerows that carried only grey garlands of traveller's joy, the scarlet of hip and haw, the rosy flower fruits of the spindle tree. It came to me then, and with almost a shock of surprise, that I had really left the autumn behind me, and that it was winter at last. Though the sun struck so warm upon my face, and the birds carolled so blithely around me, though not a fleck of cloud dimmed the azure, nor one harsh note sounded in the trees, though the cattle loitered about in the pastures, and the old horses had not forsaken the shady meadow nooks, still it was winter, and Christmas loomed but 6 short weeks ahead. The village, whose grey church tower I had seen from the heights, lay a mile or so out on the green level of the Weald. Tramping towards it through the quiet lanes, this first thought of winter seemed to tinge the whole face of nature for me. In the song of the birds in the hedgerows, and the larks in the blue, I thought to detect that evanescent opportunist quality which is the mark of the new season. The idle wind in the tree tops sent down the thrumming, thin complaint of bare branches, not the full melody of leaf-laden bells that stop the air like the sails of a ship. Day by day I had been steadily drawing away from the rich, warm zone of the west, and now I had won me my own Highland country and winter together. I knew every rooftop of the village to which my feet were wending. I trod the doorstep of the inn with all the assurance of an old familiar guest. In days gone by I had never looked upon the cheerful face of the widow who kept that inn without commiseration towards its dead and gone master, on the curtailment of what ought to have been, if it had not been, a happy life. She was an old woman now, wrinkled and grey-haired, still sturdy, though extraordinarily obese. But her eyes were the eyes of a young woman still, clear and bright, and full, you could almost say, of the untried hope of girlhood, while her laugh reminded you of the song of thrushes at eve. She leant over the half door that divided the bar from the little sunny parlour, watching me regale, her chin in one hand and the other musically jingling her keys. "Ye ne'er had a bite like that afore," quoth she, in the high sing-song drawl of the Sussex. "'Tis 4-year-old weather and true Southdown bred. Out o' Harkham Farm 'tis, where old Mast Miles, but that'n's all come about sin' ye happened through last. Old Miles, 'a wor wrong side o' 60, but 'a knowed enough to wed with sweet 23. D'ye mind Long Jack Greener, him as they called Knockabout? 'As gone for a soldier, and Mast Bridgman, down Pentworth way, what had little Sally Bridgman for a daughter? Poor man, 'as gone arter Jack, so folks say. The geese ate fine and juicy Michaelmas time, as I told ye I would, and ye ne'er come along, though ye gie your solemn word. But lor, I hadn't told ye o' the partlets. 'Twere twins last time, as belike you'll recomember, and now 'tis twins again. Fower within a 12-month, and such a hinnicent, unadventurous looking little man." So she ran on like a downland brook, whose bright water comes from nowhere apparently, just out of the bare hillside, but makes such a sparkle and tintinnabulation through the dull array of winter woods. Presently the room fell dark. A great waggon load of straw trusses had drawn up outside, cutting off the sunshine as though someone had clapped the shutters to. A new voice sounded in the bar, and the landlady turned away. "Who is that with the waggon?" I asked her when she got back to her post of surveillance. "'Tis Miles's carter, takin' wheat straw to the railroad, the old skinflint, robbin' the land again, as it allers do." "Ask him whether he is going to Amberley or Fittleworth, will you?" The answer came back, "Amberley, 'cause I want ha' to go by the bailiffs." I got my rucksack hastily to my shoulder. Amberley was on the direct route to Arundel, and the waggon would take me more than half the remainder of my way. 5 minutes later I had climbed to the top of the rustling Golden Mountain, and was voyaging down the road, feeling like an allegorical figure of husbandry on a processional car. Of the experiences and exploits narrated in these pages, there are few that I would not gladly repeat, but this ride on the straw waggon is one of them. There was no difficulty in getting to the top of the load, for the trusses made a succession of steps, and there was none in keeping there, for I sat wedged in deep between two of the highest bundles, and moreover there were stout cross ropes by which to hold on. as far as concerned the thing itself, I was as comfortable and as safe as I had been on the tailboard of the furniture van, where I had ridden on the first day of my jaunt. All my troubles were extraneous ones. The waggoner held fairly to the middle of the road, and had warned me to keep a look out for overhanging branches. But with all his care and all my vigilance, I had some very narrow escapes. Sometimes a depending bough would snatch a vicious handful of straw from the truss close to my head, and sometimes we plunged, as it were, right into the tree top, and I had to duck down while a scarring, hurtling wave of brown oak leaves swept our decks fore and aft. Then, at a corner of the way, where telegraph lines crossed the road, the wires sang their venomous song right in my ear, and were gone before I had even guessed their propinquity, far less prepared for it. Altogether it was a nerve-bracing experience, and full of a strange delight. One who has led our armies in the frontier wars of India has now, in his leisured age, a house full of memories in the form of paintings of those wild arenas and wilder times. These he made on his own battlefields after, and often before, his work was done. And he tells how he would sit placidly sketching while an occasional sniping bullet cut the turf around him or rattled among the rocks. I never fully appreciated these stories until I had that lift on the waggon load of straw. For the afternoon was of a magnificent golden tranquillity, and the view from my crow's nest such as it were hard to better even in the Sussex Weald. We moved through a smiling vale of plenty, where wood and farmland and rich pasture intermingled so variously that the eye was never tired. To my right ran the hill chain of the Downs, no longer green, but afloat now in the misty amber of the declining light. And leftward lay the broad Weald, rippled over with the winter purple of woodlands and green of blunting corn and rich umber of new-turned ploughland, until all was merged in the far-off blue Sierra of the northern Downs. All this I had constantly to keep under my eye and faithfully to study, not missing, if I could help it, a single facet of its beauty. The while, at any moment, some rustling maze of dry foliage would swoop down upon me, or some pendulous bare branch try a sniping shot at me, that was to be circumvented only by instant, dexterous burrowing in the straw. The waggon moved but at a tortoise gait. It was well past sundown before we climbed the last steep hill into the village of Houghton, and pulled up, as by instinct, outside the George and Dragon Inn. Thence to the waggon's destination was barely another mile. It was hardly worth the trouble to mount to my perch again, so here I let the waggon go on without me. I watched it down the lane and over the green brooklands beyond. I followed its dwindling bulk with my eyes until it rumbled over the old stone bridge that here spans the river Arun, until it disappeared finally in the grey twilight beyond. There goes my last lift, thought I, the last of near upon 80 happy rides over more than 200 miles, and with it must go the good vagabond times. Now I must put on respectability like a garment. I must shave again, get back to linen collars and boot polish, take up once more my part in the game of citizenship, strut on the footways and cure myself of lounging joyfully along the middle of the roads. It seemed a direful fate just then, and when I came to the river, I stopped and leaned over the weather-worn parapet of the bridge to think about it. The night was falling fast. Hardly a sound broke the stillness around me as I looked down into the water and saw there my own black reflection set about with the brightness of the stars. The river was at its full flood tide. Between its reedy banks the water lay in one motionless breadth that seemed to have gathered to it the light of all the spangled heaven. Looking about me at the wide circle of the hills, I saw now that the night had shut down upon everything. Only in the glassy depths of the water lingered any vestige of that long sun-steeped day, and this I stood and watched greedily until the last of it had vanished, and there was nothing above nor below me but darkness and the quivering silver of the stars. "I will go on," said I, "when the tide turns. When old Aaron begins to move townwards, he and I will go there side by side." And when the first clear-voiced ripple of the ebbing water sounded below me, I turned and struck into the river path for the last stage home. End of chapter 24. End of Lift Luck on Southern Roads by Tickner Edwards.